Maybe I'll come back for you." The daughter laughed as she abandoned her parents on the deserted island. But the elderly man— Margaret Sullivan covered her face with her hands as she watched the boat slowly drift away, taking her only daughter with it. The sound of the waves crashing against the golden sand couldn't muffle the echo of the cruel words Kimberly had screamed before leaving. Beside her, sitting on the old leather suitcase that had belonged to his father, Arthur kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, his lips pressed into a tense line that hid far more than simple resignation. "Maybe I'll come back for you, if you deserve it," had been Kimberly's shout, followed by a cold laugh that cut through Margaret's heart like a blade. The 67-year-old woman could still hear the vengeful tone in her 42-year-old daughter's voice, a bitterness cultivated over decades of unresolved resentments. Arthur, 69, remained in absolute silence, and that made her even more uneasy. He hadn't shown any surprise when Kimberly led them to that small, secluded beach and announced she would be staying there for a few days. In fact, now that Margaret reflected on the events, there was something strangely prepared about her husband's demeanor. The small island was about 2 hours by boat from the coast of Key West. Kimberly had insisted they take this trip, claiming she wanted to spend time with her parents, away from the pressures of the city. During the entire drive from Chicago to Miami, and then on the chartered boat, she had been attentive and affectionate, a behavior that should have alerted Margaret. It had been years since they'd seen their daughter show any genuine affection toward them. Family gatherings had become cold, obligatory rituals, punctuated by demands and veiled recriminations. "Arthur, please, say something," Margaret murmured, finally removing her hands from her face to look at her husband. "How can you be so calm? Our daughter abandoned us on a deserted island." He turned his head slowly, and Margaret noticed an expression she couldn't decipher in the blue eyes she had loved for more than 4 decades. There was determination there, but also something that looked like relief. "Margaret, my dear," he said in the hoarse voice that had become more pronounced in recent months, "I need you to trust me, just for a few days." "Trust you?" She stood up abruptly, sand clinging to her sandals. "Arthur, we're trapped here. There's no one. There's nothing. How are we going to survive? How are we going to get home?" The man sighed deeply and stood up as well, his joints protesting after sitting for so long. He walked over to the leather suitcase and opened it slowly, as if revealing a treasure. Margaret approached, curious despite her anger, and saw that inside there was far more than the clothes he had packed for the trip. There were cans of preserves, granola bars, medications, even a small portable stove and fuel. At the bottom of the suitcase, carefully protected by clothing, were documents in sealed envelopes and a spare cell phone she had never seen before. "Arthur," Margaret's voice came out as a whisper, "you knew. You knew she was going to do this." It wasn't a question. It was a painful realization that made her world crumble a little more. The man she had loved and trusted for so many years had conspired against her, or at the very least, had allowed this situation to happen. "Yes, I knew," he admitted, meeting her eyes. "But it's not what you think, Margaret. I didn't conspire with our daughter to harm us. I needed this to happen." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Margaret felt her legs go weak and let herself fall back onto the sand. The late afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of orange, creating a beauty that felt almost ironic given the revelation she had just heard. "Did this really have to happen?" she repeated, her voice heavy with disbelief. "Arthur, have you lost your mind? Why would anyone in their right mind need to be abandoned on an island?" He sat back down beside her, but kept a respectful distance, as if he understood that he had betrayed his wife's trust and needed to earn it back. "Because our family is falling apart, Margaret, and because I don't have much time left to fix it." The last sentence was spoken so quietly that she almost didn't hear it over the sound of the waves, but something in his tone made her pay attention. There was a deep sadness there, a weight she hadn't noticed before. "What do you mean you don't have much time?" Arthur took a deep breath, like someone preparing to jump off a cliff. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but Margaret could see the tremor in his hands. "I went to the doctor 3 months ago, Margaret. Dr. Harrison ordered some tests after I started having those persistent coughs. You remember, I said it was just a cold that wouldn't go away. Margaret's heart began to beat faster. She remembered the coughs perfectly, the nights he woke up gasping for air, the days when he seemed more tired than he should have been. She had suggested he see a doctor several times, but he always had an excuse to put it off. The tests showed... He paused, swallowed hard. The tests showed that I have lung cancer, Margaret. Advanced stage. Margaret's world stopped. The sound of the waves became distant. The warmth of the sun on her skin seemed to fade, and for a moment she felt as if she were floating outside her own body. Cancer. Advanced stage. The words echoed in her mind like a funeral bell. No, she whispered. No, this can't be true. You're fine. You're here. You're talking to me. I have between 3 and 6 months, according to Dr. Harrison, Arthur continued, his voice taking on a strange serenity. I could do chemotherapy, try to buy a few more months, but the quality of life would be terrible. And I decided I'd rather use the time I have left to try to fix our family. Margaret began to cry. Not silent, discreet tears, but deep sobs that came from a very deep place in her soul. 43 years of marriage, 43 years beside this man, and he was telling her he had only a few months to live. Why didn't you tell me? She managed to ask between sobs. Why did you hide this from me? Because I knew you would panic, he said gently, reaching out to touch her face, but hesitating mid-motion. You'd want me to do all kinds of treatment. You'd want a second opinion, a third opinion. You'd turn my last months into a desperate race against something that can't be won. But that's what people who love each other do, she shouted, the pain turning into anger. They fight together. They face things together. And we will face it, Margaret. But my way. His voice was firm but not harsh. I want to use my last months to try to win our daughter back, to try to rebuild our family. And I knew the only way to do that would be to create a situation where all of us would be forced to face the truth about our relationships. Margaret wiped her face with her hands, trying to process everything she had just heard. The revelation about her husband's illness had completely changed her perspective on the situation. Now she understood why he had agreed to Kimberly's crazy plan, why he had brought supplies, why he had seemed so prepared. Tell me everything, she said finally. Tell me exactly what you and Kimberly planned. Arthur settled more comfortably into the sand, as if he were about to tell a long story. And indeed it was. Kimberly came to see me 2 weeks ago, he began. She showed up at the consultancy office, said she wanted to talk to me alone. I found it strange, because for years she's only talked to me when you're present, and even then, only the essentials. Margaret nodded. It was true. Since Kimberly's turbulent divorce 3 years ago, she had drifted even further from her parents, especially from her father. She blamed Arthur for not having supported her decision to separate sooner, accusing him of having given conservative advice that kept her in an unhappy marriage longer than she should have been. She said she was tired of carrying resentment, that she wanted to make peace with the family before it was too late. She said she had reflected a lot on our relationship, and that she had a plan for us to reconnect. And you believed her, just like that, out of the blue. Arthur gave a sad smile. No, Margaret. I didn't believe her. I knew there was something more behind it. Our daughter has always been clever, but she's also always been vindictive when she felt wronged. I was certain she was planning some kind of lesson. Then why did you agree? Because I realized she was right about one thing. Our family really needed a shock to reconnect, and because I thought that maybe, if she could unload all her anger at once, we could start rebuilding our relationship on a more honest foundation. Margaret shook her head, still trying to process everything. But you didn't tell her about your illness? No. That's something I want to tell her in person, when she comes back. And she will come back, Margaret, I'm sure of it. How can you be so sure? Arthur got up and walked over to the suitcase again. From one of the side pockets he pulled out a manila envelope, because inside this envelope are the transfer documents for our house and all our dollar savings into her name. documents that only become valid if we go to the county clerk's office in person to sign them. And she'll find that out when she tries to use the documents I left with her. Margaret felt her mouth go dry. You gave our house to her? I gave her fake documents, Margaret. Very convincing, but fake. She'll find out when she tries to file the transfer. And when she discovers she was deceived, she'll come back here furious, wanting an explanation. The complexity of her husband's plan began to become clear to Margaret. It was an elaborate trap, but with a purpose she still couldn't fully understand. And you think she'll forgive us when she finds out you deceived her too? I think that when she learns about my illness, she'll understand why I did this. And I hope the three of us can have some honest conversations about our mistakes and resentments before it's too late. The sun was setting, painting the sky pink and orange. The temperature had dropped, and Margaret felt a chill run down her arms. Arthur noticed and opened the suitcase again, taking out a wool coat she recognized as one she had given him as a gift years ago. "Put this on," he said, offering the coat. "The night is going to be cold." Margaret accepted the coat, but her hands were trembling, not just from the cold, but from the emotional overload of the past few hours. As she wrapped herself in it, a new concern arose in her mind. Arthur, what if she doesn't come back? What if she decides it's not worth it? What if she simply accepts the loss of the documents and moves on with her life? "Then at least we tried," he answered, sitting down beside her again. "And at least we'll have a few days together, away from all the distractions of the city, to talk about our own relationship." "Our relationship?" Marta looked at him in surprise. "What's wrong with our relationship?" Arthur hesitated, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Marta, do you really think we're okay? When was the last time we had a real conversation about things that matter? When was the last time we did something together besides watch TV or complain about Kimberly?" The question caught Margaret off guard. She opened her mouth to respond, but realized she couldn't recall a single recent occasion she could point to as an example of genuine intimacy between them. We talk," she said, but her voice carried no conviction. "We talk about bills, about the neighbor's health, about what's on TV," Arthur corrected gently. "But when was the last time we talked about our dreams, about our fears, about what we really think and feel?" Margaret felt a lump in her throat. He was right, and she knew it. In recent years, especially since Kimberly had distanced herself from the family, she and Arthur had fallen into a comfortable but shallow routine. They shared the same roof, the same bed, the same meals, but they lived emotionally separate lives. "When you found out about the illness," she asked softly, "what was the first thought you had about me?" Arthur took his time answering, looking out at the sea, which now reflected the colors of the sunset. "My first thought was that I was going to leave you alone," he said finally. "And my second thought was that maybe you wouldn't even miss me that much, because we'd already been living like polite strangers for so long." Arthur's words hit Margaret like a punch to the stomach. They hurt because they were true. They had become companions of convenience, sharing responsibilities and habits, but without the passion and intimacy that had once defined their relationship. "I would miss you," she whispered. "I would miss you so much." "I know you would, Margaret. But would you miss who? The man who shares your bed or the man you loved when we got married?" The question hung in the air between them as the first star appeared in the darkening sky. Margaret realized she couldn't distinguish between those two versions of Arthur because she had stopped paying attention to him as a person a long time ago. They spent the first night right there on the beach, using the extra clothes from their suitcase as pillows and covering themselves with Arthur's jacket. They slept side by side, but without touching, just as they had at home for years. The difference was that now, under the starry sky and with the constant sound of the waves, they both lay awake for hours, lost in thoughts about all the revelations of the day. When Margaret finally fell asleep, she dreamed of a time when she and Arthur were young and in love, when spending a night outdoors would have been a romantic adventure rather than a consequence of family manipulations. She woke up with the sunrise and found Arthur already awake, gazing at the horizon. "Sleep well?" he asked, but his voice was hoarse, and Margaret noticed he looked paler than the day before. "Arthur, are you feeling okay?" She approached, touching his forehead. "You have a fever." "I'm fine," he said, but the cough that followed betrayed his words. "It's just the sea air. It must have irritated me a little." Margaret knew that wasn't true. She was seeing the first visible signs of the illness he had hidden from her, and the reality of his condition became much more concrete. "Did you bring your medications?" she asked, already searching in the suitcase. "I did, but there aren't many, just a few for the pain and the cough." Margaret found a small case with medicine and gave him a cough tablet with a sip of water from one of the bottles in the suitcase. While he took his medication, she looked around the beach, actually taking in her surroundings for the first time. The beach was small, perhaps 100 yards long, flanked by rocks on both sides that formed little natural pools when the tide went out. Behind them there was dense vegetation that seemed impenetrable, but Margaret could see what looked like a narrow trail between the trees. "Arthur, there's a trail over there," she said, pointing. "Do you think we should explore it? Maybe there's some kind of structure further inland." He followed her gaze and nodded. "Could be a good idea. But let's wait until you've had breakfast first. You need to keep your strength up." They shared a simple meal of crackers and a can of sardines, along with water. It was a far cry from the elaborate breakfasts Margaret was used to making at home, but there was something strangely comforting about its simplicity. "You know," she said, chewing on a cracker, "I haven't had a breakfast this simple since we were newlyweds and couldn't afford anything." "I was thinking the same thing," Arthur replied with a smile. "Remember that tiny apartment we rented? One time we went 3 days eating nothing but bread and butter because we'd run out of money, and there was still a week before I got paid." "And even then we were happy," Margaret murmured, surprising herself with how much she missed those days. "We were happy because we had hope," Arthur said. "We had our whole lives ahead of us, and every hardship felt temporary, something we'd get through together." "And when did we stop having hope?" Margaret's question hung in the air unanswered as they finished their meal in contemplative silence. Then, carrying only the essentials in a small bag Arthur had brought, they set out to explore the trail. The vegetation was denser than it had seemed from a distance, and the trail was narrow and uneven. Arthur, who had always been an active man, began to get winded after only a few minutes of walking. Margaret tried to hide her concern, but it was clear the illness was taking a toll on his stamina. After about 20 minutes of slow walking, they reached a small clearing where a rustic wooden cabin stood. It was a simple structure, clearly abandoned for some time, but the frame seemed solid. "Someone must have lived here once," Margaret said, approaching the door. "Or maybe it's a shelter for fishermen." The door wasn't locked, and when they opened it, they found a small but functional space. There was a simple bed with a mattress that, though dusty, seemed to be in good condition. A wooden table, 2 chairs, empty shelves, and a small window that looked out over the treetops. "It's perfect," Arthur said, sitting down in one of the chairs to rest. "Beats sleeping on the beach." Margaret began inspecting the corners of the cabin and made an interesting discovery. On a high shelf, she found some items left behind by previous occupants. Canned goods that were still within their expiration date, candles, matches, even some enamel plates and utensils. "Arthur, look at this," she called out, showing him the supplies. "It's like someone knew we might need these things." He got up to look, and Margaret saw something flash across his eyes, something that looked like relief. "You knew about this cabin," she said. It wasn't a question. Arthur sighed. "Kimberly mentioned there was a structure on the island. She said a friend of hers had camped here a few times and knew the place." "And the supplies? Are they part of your plan too?" "No, I wasn't expecting those," he replied, looking genuinely surprised. "They must have been left by other visitors." Margaret wanted to believe him, but her trust had been shaken by the previous day's revelations. How many other things had he planned without telling her? They spent the rest of the morning cleaning and organizing the cabin. It was physical work that required cooperation, and Margaret noticed that for the first time in years, she and Arthur were working together as a team. There was no television to distract them, no phone calls to interrupt, no neighbors stopping by to chat. It was just the two of them, focused on a common task. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us folks who are just starting out. Now continuing, during lunch made with the supplies they'd found and prepared on the small stove Arthur had brought, Margaret decided to ask a question that had been nagging at her since the night before. "You said you didn't tell Kimberly about your illness," she began, stirring the food on her plate. "But do you plan to tell her when she gets back?" "Yes, I do." "And do you think she'll take it well, considering she just found out you deceived her with the documents?" Arthur stopped eating and looked out the cabin window. "I don't know how she'll react, Margaret. Our daughter has become a woman I barely recognize. But I hope that when she learns my time is limited, she'll find a little compassion in her heart." "And what if she doesn't? What if she says you deserve to suffer for lying to her all these years?" "What years of lies?" he asked, seeming genuinely confused. "Arthur, our daughter accuses us of never having been emotionally present parents. She says we always cared more about appearances and our own lives than about her feelings. Do you think she's completely wrong?" The question created an uncomfortable silence. Arthur went back to stirring his food, but Margaret could see he was thinking deeply. "I always thought I was being a good father," he said finally. "I worked hard to give her a good education, a comfortable home, opportunities I never had. Kimberly never lacked anything material. But what about emotionally? Do you remember having deep conversations with her when she was a teenager? Asking about her fears, her dreams, her relationships?" Arthur was silent for a long time. "I thought that was the mother's role," he admitted at last. "I thought my role was to be the provider, the protector, the one who set boundaries. I thought emotional conversations were your responsibility." "And do you think I did a good job in that regard?" "You were always closer to her than I was," and he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "Arthur, I failed our daughter too," Margaret admitted, feeling a weight on her chest. "I was so worried about being a perfect mother, keeping our home perfect, keeping our family with a perfect image, that I forgot to actually get to know who our daughter was as a person." Margaret's confession opened a door to a conversation they had avoided for years. For the rest of the afternoon, they walked around the small island and talked about their failures as parents. It was a painful conversation, full of difficult admissions and tears, but there was also something liberating about finally acknowledging their shortcomings out loud. "Do you remember when Kimberly was 15 and came to tell me she had a crush on a girl from school?" Margaret asked, as they walked along a trail that circled the island. "I remember," Arthur replied. "You were very worried." "I was worried about what other people would think," Margaret corrected. "I wasn't worried about what she was feeling, about how I could help her understand her own emotions. My first reaction was trying to convince her it was just a phase. And I didn't even take part in the conversation," Arthur recalled regretfully. "I told you to handle it because it was a woman's matter." "She never talked to me about relationships again after that," Margaret said. "She never told me about anyone she was interested in again, never asked for advice about love or sexuality. I closed that door forever." They stopped at a high point on the island, where they could see the full expanse of the sea around them. There were no signs of other vessels, only the blue immensity stretching to the horizon. Maybe that's why her marriage was so troubled, Arthur reflected. She never had parents she could truly talk to about relationships. She never saw an example of how to handle conflicts in a healthy way. "Because we didn't know how to handle conflicts in a healthy way either," Margaret added. "Remember how our fights were? Either you'd explode and storm out of the house, or I'd stay silent for days. We never sat down to talk and work things out like adults. And Kimberly saw all of that. Kimberly saw all of that and learned that relationships are about power, manipulation, and resentment, not about love, understanding, and forgiveness. When they returned to the cabin late in the afternoon, both were emotionally exhausted, but there was also something different between them. The brutal honesty of their confessions had created an intimacy that hadn't existed in years. "Margaret," Arthur said as they prepared a simple meal, "can you forgive me for not telling you about the illness right away?" She stopped cutting the vegetables and looked at him. "I can understand why you did it, even though I don't agree with your decision. And can you forgive me for all the years I was a husband who was physically present but emotionally absent?" The question was harder. Margaret took time to process all the feelings that surfaced. "Can you forgive me for the years I was a controlling wife who cared more about appearances than about our real feelings, she countered. I already forgave you, he said without hesitation. And what if we could start over, knowing what we know now? We can't start over, Arthur, she replied softly. But maybe we can have a better ending. That night, they slept in the cabin's bed. It wasn't a conscious decision. It just happened naturally. They didn't make love, but they slept in each other's arms for the first time in years. Margaret felt her husband's body against hers and noticed how much weight he had lost, how much the illness was already affecting his physique. On the morning of the third day, Arthur woke up with a more intense coughing fit. Margaret grew worried when she saw small drops of blood on the handkerchief he used to cover his mouth. Arthur, this is getting worse, she said, touching his forehead, which was warm again. You need medical care. I'm fine, he insisted, but his voice was weaker. It's just the physical exertion of the last few days. No, you're not fine, she said firmly, and I'm not going to stay here watching you deteriorate. Where's that cell phone you brought? Margaret, please. Where's the cell phone, Arthur? He sighed and pointed to the suitcase. In the side pocket, but I don't want you to call anyone yet. Why? Do you want to suffer needlessly? I want Kimberly to come back and find us here. I want her to see that we stayed, that we didn't give up on the family. Margaret found the cell phone and checked the signal. There was only one bar, but it was enough to make a call. She was tempted to call an ambulance, but she understood her husband's point of view. If they were rescued now, his whole plan would have been in vain. All right, she said finally, but if you get worse, I'm calling someone, with or without your permission. Fair enough, he agreed. Throughout the morning, Margaret took care of Arthur like she hadn't in years. She prepared an herbal tea from herbs she found near the cabin, gave him his medications at the right times, and stayed by his side while he rested. It was a role reversal. For decades he had been the caregiver, the protector, and she had grown accustomed to depending on him to solve practical problems. You know, she said, as she cooled his forehead with a damp cloth, I've never seen you fragile before. In 40 years of marriage you were always the strong one, the one who took care of everything. And how does it feel seeing me like this? He asked, keeping his eyes closed. Scared, she admitted, but also close to you. It's strange to say this, but taking care of you like this made me remember why I fell in love with you. Why? Because you're letting me take care of you. You're being vulnerable with me, and that's something you haven't done in a long time. Arthur opened his eyes and looked at her. I always thought being vulnerable was a sign of weakness, that my role was to protect you from any worry or difficulty. But by protecting me from your worries, you also shut me out of your inner life, said Margaret. I wanted to be your partner, not just your dependent. And now I feel like your partner, she said, kissing his forehead. Finally. In the middle of the afternoon, they heard the sound of a boat engine approaching. Margaret ran to the window and saw a familiar vessel anchoring at the small beach where they had been dropped off 2 days earlier. It's her, said Margaret, her heart racing. Kimberly's back. Arthur got out of bed with some difficulty, but refused to accept Margaret's help to walk. I need to be standing when she arrives, he said. I need to look strong. Arthur, you don't have to pretend in front of our daughter. Yes, I do. At least at first. I can't let her see me weak before I explain everything. They walked slowly along the trail back to the beach. Arthur leaned on Margaret's arm, but tried to disguise his weakness. When they emerged from the vegetation, they saw Kimberly standing on the sand, hands on her hips in a posture that radiated anger. Kimberly was 42 years old, with brown hair always perfectly styled, and a face that combined her father's determination with her mother's sensitivity. At that moment, however, her expression was one of pure fury. You really thought I wouldn't find out? She shouted as soon as she saw them. You thought I was stupid enough to fall for this charade? Kimberly, Arthur began, but she interrupted him. No, don't come at me with excuses. She was visibly distraught. Dad, you gave me fake documents. You made me think I had inherited the house and all of the family's dollar savings. Do you know the humiliation I went through at the county clerk's office when they discovered the papers were a sham? My daughter, I can explain. Explain what? that you decided to teach me a lesson, that you thought I needed to be punished for not being the perfect daughter you wanted." Margaret stepped forward. "Kimberly, please, let your father speak. There are things you need to know." "Things I need to know?" Kimberly laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Mom, the only thing I need to know is that you two are manipulators and that I was an idiot for thinking we could reconcile. I'm sick, Kimberly." Arthur's words came out clear and firm, cutting through his daughter's anger like a blade. Kimberly stopped mid-sentence and looked at him with a confused expression. "What did you say?" "I'm sick," he repeated, his voice growing weaker. "Lung cancer, advanced stage. I have a few months to live." The silence that followed was absolute, except for the sound of the waves hitting the beach. Kimberly looked from her father to her mother, searching for signs that this was just another manipulation. "You're lying," she said finally, but her voice had lost its strength. "You're lying to make me feel guilty." Antonio started coughing, and this time he couldn't hide the blood on his handkerchief. Livia saw the red drops and her expression changed completely. "Dad?" she whispered, taking a step toward him. "I'm not lying, sweetheart," said Antonio once the coughing fit passed. "And I'm not telling you this to manipulate you. I'm telling you because you deserve an explanation for why I did all of this." Livia let herself fall onto the sand, as if her legs could no longer hold her up. "How long have you known?" 3 months. "And why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted to use the time I had left to try to fix our family," said Antonio, sitting down on the sand beside her. "And I knew that if I told you about the illness first, every conversation we had afterward would be about pity, not honesty." Livia covered her face with her hands, exactly as Marta had done 2 days before. "I don't understand. Why the sham with the documents? Why the abandonment on the island?" "Because I thought we needed a shock to force us to have real conversations," explained Antonio. "For years, our family has operated on surface-level politeness and buried resentments. I wanted to create a situation where we'd be forced to be honest with each other." "And did it work?" asked Livia, looking at him through her fingers. "Were you honest with each other?" Marta sat down on the other side of her daughter. "We've talked more honestly in the last 3 days than we have in years, Livia. Your father and I admitted a lot of mistakes we made as a couple and as parents." "What kind of mistakes?" "We failed you as emotionally present parents," said Antonio without hesitation. "We were so concerned with providing financial security and keeping up appearances that we forgot to actually know who you were as a person. And we failed each other as emotional partners too," added Marta. "In recent years we became companions of convenience instead of a couple who truly loves and supports each other." Livia stayed silent for a long time, looking out at the sea. When she finally spoke, her voice was full of pain. "Do you know why I brought you here, the real reason?" "To teach us a lesson," answered Antonio. "Not just that," said Livia. "I wanted you to feel what it's like to be abandoned. I wanted you to understand what it was like growing up feeling emotionally abandoned by you, even while living in the same house." Livia's confession hit both parents like a punch in the gut. It was exactly what Antonio had suspected, but hearing it confirmed was painful. "And how do you feel now?" asked Marta softly. "After seeing us here for 3 days. "Confused," admitted Livia, "because you didn't seem to be suffering the way I expected. You seemed closer, more connected." "We are more connected," said Antonio. "The abandonment forced both of us to face truths about our relationship that we'd been avoiding for years." "And about our relationship with you too," added Marta. "We talked a lot about our failures as parents, Livia, and we want the chance to do better in the coming months." "Coming months," repeated Livia, the reality of her father's illness hitting her with full force. "How many months exactly?" 3 to 6, according to the doctor," answered Antonio. "Maybe a little longer if I do chemotherapy, but I decided I'd rather have quality of life than quantity." Livia began to cry, not silent tears, but deep sobs that came from years of repressed pain. Marta reached out to hug her, hesitated for a moment, and then pulled her close. To her surprise, Livia didn't resist. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she managed to say between sobs. "I'm so sorry for abandoning you here. I'm so sorry for being so cruel. And I'm sorry for making you feel abandoned throughout your entire childhood, Arthur replied, reaching out to touch his daughter's face. I'm sorry for not being the emotionally present father you deserved. And I'm sorry for being a mother more concerned with control than with understanding, Margaret said, holding the two people she loved most in the world. They stayed embraced on the sand for a long time, crying for the lost years, for the unspoken words, for the opportunities for love they had wasted. When they finally pulled apart, there was something different among them, an intimacy that hadn't existed in decades. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot since we're just starting out. Now, continuing. Dad, Kimberly said, wiping her face, do you really not want to do chemotherapy? Don't you want to at least try to buy more time? Sweetheart, I've researched my condition a lot, Arthur replied. The available treatments would give me maybe a few extra months, but I'd spend most of that time sick, weak, hospitalized. I'd rather live the months I have left to the fullest. But what if there are new treatments? What if there's hope? Kimberly, I understand your desperation, Margaret said gently. I felt the same way when he told me. But he's right. The doctors were very clear about the prognosis. So what do we do now? Kimberly asked. How do we use this time? First, we go back home, Arthur said, and then we try to be a real family for the next few months. We'll talk about real things, we'll fix what can still be fixed, and we'll say goodbye the right way. And after that, Kimberly's voice was small, like a frightened child's. After that, you and your mother will keep living, Arthur said with surprising firmness. And you'll have a better relationship because the three of us will have worked to repair our family while there was still time. The trip back to the mainland was very different from the trip there. This time the three of them talked openly. Kimberly told them about her frustrations with the marriage that had ended, about how inadequate she felt as a daughter, about her fears of repeating the relationship patterns she had learned at home. Arthur and Margaret, in turn, shared more details about how they had drifted apart over the years, about how they had stopped truly communicating, about how they had let the responsibilities of adult life smother the love they had once felt for each other. You know, Kimberly said during the trip, I always thought you two had a perfect marriage. You never fought in front of me. You never separated. You always seemed like a team. We were a functional team, Margaret corrected. But we weren't emotional partners. The difference is subtle but important. And that affected the way I see relationships, Kimberly realized. I learned that marriage was about sharing responsibilities and keeping up appearances, not about emotional intimacy and vulnerability. Is that why your marriage didn't work? Arthur asked carefully. Partly, yes, Kimberly admitted. I never learned how to have difficult conversations with a partner. When problems came up, I either exploded in anger or shut down in silence. I didn't know how to be vulnerable or how to resolve conflicts in a healthy way. Because we never taught you, Margaret said with regret. We didn't know how to do it ourselves. When they got home in Chicago, it was already getting dark. The house felt different to all of them, as if 3 days of honesty had changed the energy of the place. Kimberly helped her father settle into an armchair in the living room while Margaret made some tea. Dad, said Kimberly, sitting on the sofa across from him, I want to spend more time with you both in the coming months. I want to make up for all the years I was an absent daughter. You weren't an absent daughter, Kimberly, Arthur corrected. You pulled away because you didn't know how to connect with us genuinely. That was on us, not you. Still, I want to make it up. Can I work from home a few times a week? Can I come over for lunch regularly? Of course you can, said Margaret, bringing the tea. Actually, I would love that. But I want it to be different this time, Kimberly continued. I don't want our time together to be based on superficial politeness. I want real conversations, even if they're hard. Real conversations about what? Arthur asked. About everything. About my childhood. About how you two met. About your regrets. About my fears. About how you really feel about the choices you've made in life. That could be painful, Margaret warned. I know, said Kimberly. But shared pain is better than emotional distance. I learned that in the last 3 days. In the weeks that followed, the Sullivan family experienced a remarkable transformation. Kimberly kept her promise to spend more time with her parents, but this time the visits were completely different. Instead of polite talk about the weather and neighborhood gossip, they had deep discussions about life, love, regrets, and hopes. Arthur told Kimberly stories about his own childhood that she had never heard, about how his father had been emotionally distant, about how he had sworn he would be different, only to repeat the same patterns without realizing it. Margaret shared her own insecurities about motherhood, about how she had felt inadequate as a mother from the start, about how she had tried to compensate by being perfect in other areas of domestic life. And Kimberly, in turn, opened her heart about years of emotional loneliness, about failed relationships, about the feeling of never being good enough for anyone. "You know what's funny?" Kimberly said during one of the lunches that had become a weekly tradition. "I spent years thinking you didn't love me enough, and you spent years thinking you didn't know how to love me properly." "And all sides were right," Arthur observed. "We loved you, but we didn't know how to express that love in a way you could feel. And I knew you loved me, but I couldn't feel loved because the love wasn't being communicated in the language I needed to hear," Kimberly added. "What language did you need to hear?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious. "I needed conversations about my feelings. I needed you to ask about my fears, my dreams, my doubts. I needed to feel seen as an individual person, not just as a reflection of your success as parents." "And what language did you need from us?" Kimberly asked. "We needed patience with our mistakes," said Arthur, "and recognition for the efforts we made, even when they fell short. And we needed you to understand that our flaws as parents didn't mean we didn't love you deeply," Margaret added. These conversations became the foundation for a new family dynamic. For the first time in decades, they were learning about each other as complex people, not just as family roles. As the weeks went by, Arthur's health gradually declined. He had good days and bad days, but the overall trend was downward. Margaret and Kimberly took turns caring for him, and those hours of care became some of the most intimate the family had ever shared. "Dad," Kimberly said one afternoon while helping him with his medications, "are you afraid of leaving?" It was a question that Margaret had never dared to ask, but that everyone was thinking. "I'm afraid of leaving you two suffering," Arthur answered honestly, "but I'm not afraid of the departure itself. I feel at peace because I managed to fix our family before leaving." "Do you really think our family is fixed?" Kimberly asked. "I think our family finally learned how to truly love one another," he said, "and that's more than I ever imagined would be possible a few months ago." "And you, Mom?" Kimberly turned to Margaret. "How do you feel about what's to come?" Margaret took a deep breath before answering. "I'm devastated by the prospect of losing your father, but I'm also grateful for the last few months we had together. We reconnected as a couple and as a family in a way I no longer thought was possible." "And us?" Kimberly asked. "Do you think we'll manage to keep this closeness after Dad is gone?" "I hope so," said Margaret, "but it will take conscious effort from both of us. It will be easy to fall back into old patterns when we're dealing with the grief of loss." "Then let's make a pact," Kimberly proposed. "Let's commit to keep having honest conversations, even when it's hard. Let's commit to not letting resentments build up again." "I accept that pact," said Margaret, reaching out her hand to her daughter. "And I'm a witness," said Arthur with a weak but genuine smile. During one of the last days when Arthur still had the strength to leave the house, he asked to visit the beach where it all had begun. Not the island, that would have been impossible in his condition, but a public beach in Atlantic City where they had gone a few times when Kimberly was a child. The three of them sat on the sand, watching the waves, and Arthur said something that would be etched into Margaret's and Kimberly's memories forever. "Do you know what the greatest gift this experience gave me was?" he asked. "What?" Margaret and Kimberly asked almost in unison. "The opportunity to know my wife and my daughter as real people," he said. "I spent 40 years living with you two, but only now did I truly get to know you. And you are far more interesting, complex, and wonderful than I ever imagined." Those words summed up perfectly what had happened to the Sullivan family. The crisis had forced all of them to shed the masks they wore with one another and to truly know each other for the first time. Arthur passed away on a quiet autumn morning, at home, surrounded by Margaret and Kimberly. His last words were of gratitude for having had the chance to fix his family, Gratitude for having known his two favorite women as real people. Gratitude for leaving in peace. The funeral was small and intimate, exactly as he had requested. But the most remarkable thing was the way Margaret and Kimberly supported each other throughout the process. Instead of isolating themselves in their own pain, they shared the experience of loss in an open and honest way. "You know," Kimberly said to Margaret after the funeral, as they were going through Arthur's belongings, "I feel so much more than just sadness. I feel gratitude too." "Gratitude?" Margaret asked, surprised. "Gratitude for having had the chance to truly know my father before it was too late. Gratitude for having had months of honest conversations with the two of you. Gratitude for now having a mother I can truly call a friend." Margaret began to cry, but they weren't tears of sadness alone. They were tears of a complex mix of emotions, pain from the loss but also relief at having her daughter back, and hope for a new phase in their lives. In the months that followed, Margaret and Kimberly kept the pact they had made. They kept meeting regularly, kept having honest conversations, kept working on rebuilding their relationship on a more solid foundation. "Sometimes I wonder," Kimberly said during one of the lunches they had maintained as a tradition, "if Dad planned all of this from the beginning, if he knew exactly how things would unfold." "I think he had hope," Margaret replied. "He bet that if the three of us were forced to face the truth about our family, we could find a way to love each other better. And he was right. He was right." A year after Arthur's passing, Margaret and Kimberly decided to take a trip together. Not to the island where it all had begun, that place would always remain too special to be casually revisited, but to a wellness retreat in a mountain town in the countryside outside Miami. It was during that trip that Kimberly made an important confession to her mother. "Mom, I've met someone," she said one afternoon as they walked along a wooded trail. "Someone special?" Margaret asked, trying not to show how eager she was to hear the answer. "Very special," Kimberly confirmed with a smile. "A woman named Jennifer. She's a psychologist. She has 2 kids from a previous relationship, and she's wonderful." "And how do you feel about her?" Margaret asked, remembering the conversation about sexual orientation that had failed so miserably years ago. "I feel happy," Kimberly said simply, "happier than I've felt in years, and this time I'm managing to have honest conversations about our feelings and our fears. I'm managing to be vulnerable without feeling weak." "Because you learned how to do that," Margaret observed. "Exactly. The last few months with you and Dad taught me how to have real emotional intimacy. And now I'm managing to apply those lessons in my relationship with Jennifer. I would love to meet her," Margaret said sincerely. "You really would?" Kimberly asked, still a little insecure despite all the closeness they had earned. "Kimberly, I want to meet anyone who makes you happy," Margaret said firmly. "And I want to be present in your life in a way I was never able to be before." "And the grandchildren you always dreamed of?" Kimberly asked carefully. "Jennifer has kids, but they're not biologically mine." "Sweetheart," Margaret interrupted, "I've learned that family isn't about biology or about fulfilling dreams I projected onto your life. It's about love, presence, and genuine connection. If Jennifer and her children are going to be part of your life, then they're going to be part of mine too." When they returned from the trip, Kimberly brought Jennifer and the kids over to meet Margaret. It was a somewhat nervous gathering at first, but it quickly turned into a pleasant afternoon full of conversation, laughter, and the beginning of new family bonds. "Your mother is exactly as you described," Jennifer said to Kimberly at the end of the visit. "I can see where your determination to build honest relationships comes from." "Actually," Kimberly corrected, "we both learned that together recently. My mother had to take a journey just as difficult as mine to get where we are today." 2 years after the island episode, Margaret made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She decided to go back to school. At 69, she enrolled in a psychology program at a state university in Chicago. "Why psychology, Mom?" Kimberly asked when she heard the news. "Because I discovered I have a great interest in understanding how families work," Margaret replied. "And because I want to help other people avoid the mistakes we made for so many years." "You want to work as a psychologist?" "I want to work with family therapy," Margaret said with a conviction that surprised even herself. "I want to help families have the difficult conversations before it's too late." The program was challenging for Margaret. Going back to school at 69 after decades as a homemaker required a discipline and determination she didn't know she had, but it was also deeply rewarding. Every class on family dynamics, communication, and conflict resolution offered her new perspectives on her own journey. Kimberly, for her part, decided to start individual therapy to keep working through personal issues that had come up during the family conversations. And later, she and Jennifer began couples therapy to make sure they were building their relationship on a solid foundation of honest communication. "You know," Kimberly said to Margaret during one of the family gatherings that now included Jennifer and the children, "sometimes I feel like Dad is still with us, watching how our family has evolved." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. "I see him in the way you and I talk now. I see him in the courage you had to go back to school. I see him in how I was able to open myself up to love again. I feel like his sacrifice created a wave of healing that's still spreading." Margaret smiled, touched by her daughter's observation. "I think you're right. Your father always believed that one small act of courage can have far greater consequences than we imagine. His plan wasn't just to bring us together for a few months. It was to teach the three of us how to love more deeply and honestly. And that lesson is spreading to our new family too," added Jennifer, who had become not just Kimberly's partner, but a close friend to Margaret. "You're teaching my children that conflicts can be resolved through conversation, that differences can be accepted with love, that families can choose to grow and improve together." 3 years after the experience on the island, Margaret graduated with a degree in psychology and began seeing families at a community outreach center in Chicago. Her first case was a mother and daughter who hadn't spoken in 5 years due to disagreements about life choices. During the first session, Margaret looked at the two women sitting on opposite sides of the room, each convinced she was right and the other was wrong, and she saw a reflection of what she and Kimberly had been a few years earlier. "You know," she said gently, "sometimes we need a crisis to force us to have the conversations we've been avoiding for years. Sometimes the most painful situations can become opportunities to build more honest and deeper relationships." Over the following months, Margaret helped dozens of families find ways to reconnect. Each case was different, but she always started from the same principle she had learned on the island, that genuine love requires the courage to be vulnerable and the honesty to admit mistakes. "Do you know what the most rewarding part of my work is?" Margaret said to Kimberly during one of the weekly family dinners that had become a tradition. "What?" "Seeing families have their first truly honest conversations, seeing the moment when parents and children stop trying to win arguments and start trying to understand each other. It's like watching people rediscover how to love." "Like we did," Kimberly observed. "Like we did," Margaret confirmed. "And every family that manages to make that transition is a tribute to your father's memory and the sacrifice he made for us." 4 years after those 3 transformative days on the island, Margaret and Kimberly's blended family gathered to celebrate Margaret's 75th birthday. At the table were Kimberly, Jennifer, Jennifer's 2 children, who now called Margaret Grandma, and a few close friends who had become chosen family. During dinner, Kimberly stood up to make a toast. "I want to toast the bravest woman I know," she said, looking directly at Margaret. "A woman who at 67 had the courage to admit her mistakes, at 69 went back to school, at 72 started a new career, and at 75 continues learning and growing every day. And I want to toast," added Margaret, also standing up, "to a daughter who taught me that it's never too late to start over, that family is something we consciously build every day, and that true love is something we choose to practice, not just feel. And I want to toast," said Jennifer, joining the toast, "to a man I never met but who changed all our lives. Arthur, wherever you are, thank you for teaching us that sometimes we need to create a crisis to find a cure." As they toasted, Margaret looked around the table and felt deep gratitude for the winding path that had led her family to this moment. The pain of losing Arthur was still present, but it had been transformed into something constructive, a force that drove them to love better, communicate more honestly, and cherish every moment of genuine connection. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Margaret and Kimberly sat on the porch of the house, looking at the stars and talking about the father and husband who had orchestrated the transformation of their lives. "Mom," said Kimberly softly, Do you think Dad knew things would turn out this way? That you would become a therapist? That I would find love again, that our family would grow so beautifully? I think your father had a vision, replied Margaret thoughtfully. Not specific about the details, but a vision that we were capable of so much more love and connection than we were showing. He bet on our capacity to grow. And look at what we've become, said Kimberly, smiling. A family that truly knows each other, supports each other, and loves each other consciously and intentionally. The kind of family I always dreamed we would be, but never knew how to create, agreed Margaret. And the kind of family I'm going to teach Jennifer's children to build for themselves in the future, added Kimberly. They fell silent for a moment, contemplating the extraordinary journey they had traveled together. From a fragmented and emotionally distant family, they had transformed into a group of people who knew each other deeply, supported each other unconditionally, and loved each other with all the complexity and imperfection that true love requires. You know, said Margaret finally, sometimes I wonder if other families need to go through a crisis as dramatic as ours to find that kind of connection. I hope not, replied Kimberly. I hope some families are wise enough to start having honest conversations before it's too late. And that's why I love my work as a therapist, said Margaret, because I can help families find that honesty without having to wait for a crisis to force them into it. Dad's legacy multiplies through your work, observed Kimberly. And through the way you're building your new family too, countered Margaret. You're creating a home based on honest communication and conscious love. Jennifer's children will grow up knowing how to have real emotional intimacy. It's funny, said Kimberly, laughing softly. If someone had told me 4 years ago that I'd be having this conversation with you on a porch, talking about conscious love and emotional intimacy, I would have said it was impossible. And if someone had told me that I'd be a 75-year-old psychologist helping other families reconnect, I would have found that impossible too, added Margaret. Maybe that's the greatest lesson Dad taught us, reflected Kimberly. That it's never too late to transform our life and our relationships. That we can choose to grow and change at any age. And that sometimes the situations that seem most hopeless can turn into the greatest blessings of our lives. Margaret agreed. 5 years after that first day on the island, Margaret received an invitation that moved her deeply. Kimberly and Jennifer had decided to get married, and they wanted the ceremony to be on the beach, not on the island where it all began, but on an accessible beach where the whole extended family could be present. We want you to give a speech at the ceremony, Kimberly said, as she handed the invitation to her mother. About family, about love, about second chances. I would be honored, Margaret replied, her voice trembling with emotion. But what exactly do you want me to say? We want you to tell our story, Jennifer said. The story of how a family can transform when people have the courage to be honest with one another. Because our story isn't just about the three of us, Kimberly added. It's about the possibility of healing and transformation that exists in any family, no matter how broken it may seem. On the day of the wedding, Margaret stood before a group of about 50 people, family, friends, co-workers, patients who had become friends, and told the story of 3 days on an island that had changed 3 lives forever. The story I'm going to tell you, she began, is about a wise man who understood that sometimes we need to create a storm to find the calm. It's about a woman who learned that it's never too late to truly know the people we love. And it's about a daughter who discovered that forgiveness and love can coexist with honesty about past wounds. She told them about the abandonment on the island, about the painful revelations, about the difficult conversations, and about the gradual transformation that had followed. She spoke about how Arthur's conscious sacrifice had created waves of healing that were still spreading through their lives and through the lives of the people they touched. The most important lesson we learned, she concluded, is that family isn't something that simply happens to us. It's something we consciously create, every day, through the choices we make about how we communicate, how we support one another, and how we choose to love each other despite our imperfections. Kimberly and Jennifer are starting a new family today based on those principles, a family that chooses honesty over convenience, vulnerability over control, growth over stagnation. And all of us here today are invited to be part of that extended family, based not on blood or obligation, but on conscious love and mutual support. When she finished her speech, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. But these weren't tears of sadness or nostalgia alone. They were tears of recognition, of hope, of gratitude for the possibility of love and healing that exists in every family, even the most wounded ones. After the ceremony, a woman approached Margaret. "My name is Carmen," she said. "I'm the mother of 3 adult children who haven't spoken to me in 2 years. After hearing your story, I'd like to schedule an appointment with you. I want to try to rebuild my family." "It would be my pleasure to help you," Margaret replied, "but know that it will require a great deal of courage on your part. Rebuilding family relationships means being willing to admit mistakes, to hear painful truths, and to change behavioral patterns you may have used for decades." "I'm ready," Carmen said with determination. "If a family can transform the way yours did, then there's hope for mine too." In that moment, Margaret understood that her family's story had become much bigger than their own lives. It had become a symbol of hope for other people struggling with fractured family relationships. 6 years after the island, Margaret turned 76 and decided to write a book about her experience. Not as a self-help manual, but as an honest narrative about the challenges and rewards of rebuilding family relationships in old age. "Why a book, Mom?" Kimberly asked when she found out about the project. "Because I meet many families in my consultancy office who think it's too late to change," Margaret explained. "Especially people from my generation who were raised believing that deep changes only happen when we're young. And you want to prove that isn't true. I want to share our living proof that growth, healing, and transformation can happen at any age," Margaret confirmed. "And that sometimes the deepest and most fulfilling relationships of our lives only begin when we have the courage to be completely honest with each other." The book, titled "It's Never Too Late: 3 Days That Changed 3 Lives," became a modest publishing success, not because it offered easy solutions, but because it offered realistic hope. Margaret began receiving letters from readers all over the country, telling their own stories of family reconciliation and personal transformation. One of the letters that touched her most came from an 80-year-old man from Recife. "Dr. Margaret, I read your book and decided to call my son after 5 years of not speaking. Our first conversation was difficult, but it was honest for the first time in decades. Now we talk every week, and he's coming to visit me next month. I thought I had lost my son forever, but your book showed me that it's never too late to start over. Thank you for sharing your story with us." "Dad would be proud," Kimberly said when Margaret read the letter to her. "He bet on the healing of 3 people, but ended up inspiring hundreds." "I think that was exactly what he hoped for," Margaret replied. "He always believed that a courageous action can create waves that go far beyond what we can imagine." 7 years after the island experience, Margaret had a surprise she didn't expect. Jennifer was pregnant, and she and Kimberly had decided to use in vitro fertilization to have a biological child together. "We're going to have a baby," Kimberly announced, beaming during one of the family dinners. "And we want you to be the most present grandmother this baby could have." Margaret was moved to tears. At 77, she was going to become a real grandmother for the first time. But even more importantly, she was going to be a grandmother who knew how to create deep emotional bonds from the start. "I'm going to teach this baby about the great-grandfather he'll never meet," Margaret promised. "I'll tell him about the brave man who taught our family how to truly love each other. And we're going to raise this baby in a family that knows how to have honest conversations, resolve conflicts with respect, and express love consciously," Jennifer added. "He'll grow up knowing that family is something we actively build, not something that simply happens to us." When the baby was born, a boy they named Arthur in honor of the grandfather, Margaret felt a completeness she didn't know was possible. Holding that child in her arms, knowing he would grow up in a family based on conscious love and honest communication, was the final confirmation that her husband's sacrifice had been worth it. "Hello, little Arthur," she whispered to the baby during one of her first visits. "Your family has an incredible story to tell you when you grow up. A story about how love can transform anything, even when it seems impossible." 8 years after those 3 transformative days on the island, Margaret's extended family gathered to celebrate little Arthur's first birthday. The table included Margaret, Kimberly, Jennifer, Jennifer's 2 older sons, now teenagers who called Kimberly Mom, baby Arthur, and several friends who had become chosen family. During the party, Margaret looked around and was impressed by what she saw. A family that truly knew one another, supported each other through hard times, celebrated each other's accomplishments, and had honest conversations about everything, from small disagreements to major life decisions. "You know what the most beautiful thing about this family is?" Jennifer said to Margaret as they watched the children playing. "What?" "Nobody here is afraid of conflict because we all know we can work anything out by talking. Nobody holds grudges because we all know how to apologize and forgive. And nobody feels alone because we all know we're accepted exactly as we are." "It's the kind of family your grandfather always dreamed we could be," Margaret said, looking at little Arthur, who slept peacefully in Kimberly's arms. "And it's the kind of family this baby will consider normal, because it's the only one he'll ever know. He'll grow up thinking all families communicate honestly and love each other consciously," Kimberly observed. "And when he finds out not all of them are like that, maybe he can help other families learn what we've learned." "The legacy lives on," Margaret murmured, moved by the thought that Arthur's teachings could carry on through the generations. That night, after everyone had gone home, Margaret sat alone on the porch looking up at the stars and talking silently to her husband, who had passed away 8 years earlier. "You did it, my love," she thought. "You managed to build the family we always dreamed of having. And more than that, you created a legacy that will spread far beyond our own lives. Our granddaughter will grow up in a family that knows how to truly love. My patients are learning to rebuild their own families. Our friends are seeing that transformation is possible at any age. 3 days on an island turned into an entire lifetime of deeper, more conscious love. And all because you had the courage to bet on our ability to grow." A soft breeze swept across the porch, stirring the leaves of the plants Margaret had carefully tended over the years. For a moment, she could almost feel Arthur's presence there beside her, silently approving everything they had built together. "Thank you," she whispered to the stars. "Thank you for teaching me that it's never too late to learn how to love better." End of story. So what did you think of this story of transformation and family love? Have you ever faced difficult situations that turned into opportunities for growth? Share your thoughts in the comments about second chances and family reconciliation. Your story could inspire others going through similar moments. Don't forget to leave your like to support our work and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories like this one.